Hello everyone. Today we are looking at women in art in ancient Rome and early Christianity. We are not going through the Byzantine period, that will be next. So we're just looking at the early period of Christianity. So here are the topics that we're looking at. So you can take a gander at those. So the roles of and representations of women in Roman art. Some background and stuff with this is that there were kind of two main periods to the Roman world. We already talked about I mentioned the Roman kingdom, which was a tributary state under the Etruscans. We looked at Etruscan art. So there technically are like three periods, and I suppose you could say four if you broke the Roman Empire into its kind of two periods. But there's three main periods, and really two that most people know about, which is the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. But there was the kingdom before that under the Etruscans. So we're looking largely at art in the Empire, but we will briefly talk about the Republic too, and the changes that took place between that. So the first was the Republic, and the later was the Empire. During the Republic, right, there was emphasis in art was placed on the virtue of the Roman Republic, right? So we'll put here virtue of Roman. Oh, that did something weird there with that. Roman Republic. And one's duty to Rome, essentially. And this period was more restrictive for women in general. Technically, women were under the paterfamilias laws, which literally gave the power of life and death to either the father or husband. Now, it was frowned upon to kill your wife or kids, but technically legal, but again, frowned upon. So it wasn't something that was going on all the time. But the idea being, and the paterfamilias laws actually went on for quite a while, even into the empire, but they very much loosened and restrictions over the years within that. But Rome was a patriarchal society. However, as harsh as the paterfamilias laws sound, we'll see that Roman women had quite a bit of freedom, even in the Republic, where they had less compared to like what we looked at with the Greek women. And in part, they do owe that to the Etruscans, and we saw the kind of freedom and expression of women in the Etruscan art. And Rome developed under the Etruscans, and they had a lot of artistic, technological, cultural aspects of the Etruscans that they brought with them when they broke free from the Etruscans and formed the Republic. So that certainly plays into with these kind of strict paterfamilias laws that women still had more rights than like Greek women when the period that we looked at and stuff. Romans prided themselves in the Republic being frugal and hardworking. Like there was a saying that some group, and I don't remember who, tried to insult the Romans by saying they were porridge eaters, right? Like boring, bland, just ate porridge. And the Romans took that and embodied that as actually something that was something to be proud of, right? They should be proud of being porridge eaters. So it was very much this kind of frugal, hardworking, that you were supposed to, focus on the idea of, for men, being a soldier and civic duty, as well as like sacrifice for the Roman Republic. For women, the ideal woman was one who was a loyal mother, sacrifice for Rome's virtue, pietas was like a big thing within that as well. So what happens with this is the Punic Wars kind of change everything, and including women's roles, especially for the patricians. Now there were two, there are the plebeians and the patricians. The patricians or the wealthy, and this was somewhat of a caste system and the plebeians were everyone else. So the plebeians, plebeians, multitude, patricians, like the kind of father group, the wealthy group. They were the aristocrats, and the plebeians were the majority of the Romans. And you, even if you became extremely wealthy, and this is actually going to create a problem in Rome later after the Punic Wars, is that you had plebeians that were wealthier than patricians, but they could never be patricians because they weren't born into patrician families. Eventually they create a third class, the equestrian class, to like accommodate those plebeians that were way too wealthy to be considered a plebeian anymore, but couldn't be considered patrician because they weren't born into that. But you could have poor patricians and wealthy plebeians, but usually it's split along. The aristocrat and wealthy were patricians, the plebeians, the majority of Romans who were, middling to lower class individuals. So especially for the patricians, for women, roles changed significantly. Men were at war for a very long time during the Punic Wars. There were 3 phases to it. And because they were gone for so long, women took over jobs that had previously been reserved for men. They started wearing jewelry and being more independent, socializing more openly. This expanded further with the increase in slaves that were brought back from the war. Because Rome started conquering so much land during this time, there was just a massive influx of slaves. They became very cheap. And not only could patricians have a large number of household slaves, but even middling plebeians could afford a slave or two in the home. Very different experience as a slave if you were in a patrician home versus a plebeian home. But nonetheless, the ability to have now a large number of slaves with the household meant that those household tasks that had traditionally been connected to women were now done by slaves. This freed up wealthy women's time with more time for leisure, to attend dinner parties and social events. Women under this period in the empire. Oh, okay. And so then that goes into the later Republic period, which eventually transforms into the empire with the Caesars. During the empire, women gained larger education, public participation in business ownership, artistic patronage, even with the patriarchal control that existed. And so women would commission artworks, create artworks, and could actually have some of their own wealth. All of these things had been largely restricted in the early Republic period. So the Punic Wars and right after the Punic Wars was still the Republic, but because the Punic Wars, the later part of the Republic changed in a lot of the culture. And then by the time that Julius Caesar started and then Augustus the first emperor, and with the Roman Empire, you have significant difference in women's roles within Rome because of those changes that took place. And so this just showcases a Roman family, which we'll look at with some of the style and type of art that they had. And one of the examples here is that a lot of Roman art was, and there were kind of 2 types of art. Propaganda, and then realistic art or realism, and emphasis on realism. Things that wanted to showcase and highlight the family tended to focus on realism, right? They were trying to depict what people actually looked like rather than idealizing them. But the Roman Empire and the Republic, the artwork that the Republic did tended to be much more focused on realism as well. But by the time you get to the Roman Empire, there is a whole other section of this with the emperor and the royalty and all that is using artwork for propaganda. Whether that's commissioning artwork to highlight certain values or traditions or beliefs, whether that's the way that the sculptures are portrayed in an idealized form. And we'll look at that too and how that showed, right? Where there was a political propaganda purpose to it. Versus just simply being a household, not photo, but I mean, that's what this was kind of meant to function as, that we see here, is it was meant to represent and look like the family as a photo would, rather than an idealized sculpture that transformed you with the filters and photos that make you look, a lot nicer with that. So in the Roman world, art didn't exist just for art's sake. Again, it was usually this for individuals or for the emperor and free people to present themselves. Images of Roman empresses were on coins, in reliefs, architectural sculptures, cameos, and many, many other items. Elite women were, and so here's some examples of that before we talk about the elite women and stuff that way. You have examples of royal women or like, so the wives of, so in this case, this is Livia. And she's the first one to be given the title Augusta. Augustus is the first one to get the title Augustus. So it makes sense. So on one side of the Roman coin, you have Augustus, and who was the Roman emperor. And then on the other side, you have his wife, Livia, who'd been given the name Diva Augusta. And then is sitting there holding these kind of symbols of chastity and loyalty and piety to the Roman Empire. So a lot of times women were intentionally portrayed, and this is definitely that propaganda, in these idealized virtues. There were a lot of what was called like Roman virtues, and that even in that they'd kind of actually taken from the Roman Republic, and even though in practice they weren't always happening anymore, the Roman Empire was like a let's keep pretending these exist, not only in virtues, but like the senators and stuff like that. Like, let's keep pretending that we have a republic and that's how it functions. And it's not just the emperor telling us what to do in that case, right? But the fact that women were on coins, is significant. These women were elevated in status, while still having some restrictions on them. And there's this fine line between women weren't really allowed to be part of the political world, except for royal family members in these kind of public ways to be expressed in Roman virtues, right? So just because Livia was on the coin, or we have another one here that was a mother and daughter that were sister and niece of the emperor. So this was a sister of the emperor. This was the niece of the emperor, right? And then mother daughter relationship and stuff. They weren't that didn't give them political power to speak out and shape politics openly, because again they were highlighted in this meant to be of these virtues. The daughter, she had several kids, and so they're shown here. So she was put on as like this ideal version of where there was an emphasis on women and specifically the patricians and motherhood. And then of course his sister though has this kind of poise and looking kind of regal and respectable, right? This idea of honest and virtuous and pious and motherhood. They tended to chastity. She one of the things that she was represented as was chastity. So the idea was they were used in this way in propaganda to highlight these Roman virtues, especially on coins. But we'll see women are going to take their own agency in some things as well. So there's this weird contradiction because it shows the power that women had to even be put on coinage. In this case, this coin is both women, right? In many cases, it was always the emperor and his mom or the emperor and his wife. So if one side's one, one's the other. But they also were obviously on their own coins as the coinage as well. And that's an elevated state just to even have women on your coinage. But at the same time, these were very much used as propaganda to promote these patrician women in a certain idealized virtue symbol more than any kind of individual agency. But we'll look at Livia will do her own patronage and assert her own agency in other ways through art as well. So it's, like I said, a kind of a weird dichotomy between elevated status and still mostly just being used for propaganda purposes versus art that they're commissioning or having done with in their own name, that they're choosing and establishing and creating with that. Women, and this is that the public dedications showcasing their social status and benefactions. That's the commissioning of artwork of buildings that then they had named after them, or they would name them sometimes after relatives, but their name would always be attached to the building, and then it would be dedicated and given to the city of which it was created in. Sculptures, the whole idea was, right, dedications in these public places to highlight their power, and also usually try to like connect with whatever kind of image they wanted to present. So again, very much propaganda, like look how much my duty to Rome and my civic duty, my sacrifice to Rome, and how pious I am, that I am, spending my own money to build these grand buildings for this city. And then they would have sculptures and other aspects and paintings in these buildings that would all fit within that kind of idealism that they wanted in the propaganda for it. But they were choosing it themselves, which is a big deal, versus just being pawns within the artistic world, which does have a different role within that. Sculptures and reliefs were also common ways that both elite and non-elite women across the empire articulated their identities in their work. Freeborn women, freed and enslaved women, like their male counterparts, were well represented in art, especially funerary reliefs. There's a ton. So like one of the probably the most common way that women were shown in terms of just sheer number was actually funerary reliefs, because whether you were wealthy or a slave, you could have like a tombstone and a relief on that tombstone highlighting something important about you, usually that either someone close to you thought was important to highlight about you, or that you wanted on there, that you specified. Now, not everyone could afford a funerary tombstone. There were actually associations, this is what they're called, associations, that were groups that lower class individuals could actually basically be in this club that they put monthly money to, and it ensured that everyone who was in this association when they died there was enough money to buy a tombstone for them, so that they weren't left without it, which was definitely something that was a concern of that people thought that were important. Tombs lined the roads leading to and from Roman cities, and it attracted the attention of passerbys. And these reliefs then, when next to funerary inscriptions and grave markers, gave kind of a diverse look at the labor that Roman women performed, if it was of the regular plebeian class, because they usually put, again, things that were associated or attributed to them. And so, of course, while the patricians, had much more elaborate funerary reliefs and tombs, the plebeians also did as well. Sculpture and other things like that, and frescoes and paintings, women are displayed. Rome was not shy about portraying women in art. They're all over so much art. But if you're just looking at sheer number, the funerary reliefs are probably the main, by far something that all women, no matter what their social status, were a part of in that. And so if it was based on idealism and stuff like that, the sculptures and paintings often depicted women as young, dignified, and beautiful to promote the Roman imperial ideas. Again, the empire had a lot of emphasis on wanting to portray certain ideals and propaganda. Even a famous artist would be commissioned directly by emperors and empresses to create certain artwork that wasn't the artist creating art for art's sake, but was creating it based on the specific expectations and directions of the person commissioning the artwork itself. what I'm saying there. However, there was also, as I mentioned, it's these two parts. There was realistic portraiture as well. Some art was meant to show how women actually looked and show a realistic look into their daily life, including mothers, wives, daughters, and female workers. Here, Pompeii is going to be one of our best resources for artwork because of Mount Vesuvius erupting and the ash covering everything. It actually preserved Pompeii. In that day, like, they didn't change. Well, the rest of Rome, developed and changed and transformed, and different artworks were covered over or destroyed. Pompeii, the work that was in Pompeii, we get to see what a Roman city looked like in that exact day that Mount Vesuvius erupted. And so we actually have a lot of artwork that was preserved from that. And this is one of them. But it does show these women hanging out and gathering together and talking, and is not, it's meant to be just a snapshot into life and what was going on. So one of the things that was common was showing women's work in daily life in Roman art, and largely non-patricians, although some of the artwork in showing the women working showed the patrician women as well. The domestic sphere, specifically like hairdressers and midwives, were common images in funerary art and just in art in general. Again, a lot of funerary art tended to highlight like that work and labor. Hairdressing was a very common female occupation, and it could be both enslaved women attending wealthy women or independent hairdressers, which there were plenty of both. All of the patricians had enslaved women that did their hair and took care of a lot of other needs too. This specific artwork here, we see the wealthy patrician woman is sitting in the wicker chair with her feet up on this kind of little pedestal, while surrounded by female attendants that were enslaved women. One looks like she's holding up what they called a looking glass, which was a mirror, while another woman tends to her hair. It's a little hard to see, but her hair is much more elaborately done. Also, her dress is more elaborate than the women that are attending to her, that are in much more simple dress. And their hair is kind of just up in a bun compared to the more elaborate design that's being done on her. But again, it gives us this snapshot not only into the patrician world with the women sitting there, but the enslaved women that were attending to her and dressing her hair. This is a larger one, so probably it's connected to the household, because, or if it is to the woman, there probably are other scenes on it that show her in other aspects of her life as well. But again, there were enslaved women who had funerary art as well. There was some suggestion that because the slaves were shown in this, and is most likely because, again, of the size, her funerary tombstone, that the fact that they were shown at all was intentional to show that she actually owned them with her own wealth, rather than her husband, because a lot of times women's wealth was connected to their husband, and so technically the husband owned the slaves, even if they largely worked with the wife. But to have them specifically being portrayed and shown here could have been intentional to highlight, not that you just had slaves, because all patrician families did after the Punic Wars, but that she wanted that emphasized because she had purchased them with her own money, which was then a signifier of her own wealth and independence in that process. Another common scene was delivering children with midwives. Midwives could be both, actually, just like hairdressers, enslaved or independent, and were vital, obviously, for childbirth, and were very frequently depicted in Roman art, assisting women during delivery. Enslaved women, actually men or women, who had medical training had an extremely high value regardless of gender. And certain doctors and midwives were valued slaves because they had expertise in women's health. Obviously, independent midwives and doctors were valuable too, but Rome, the whole like process of slavery in Rome was very complex. There wasn't just one type of uneducated slave or something like that. You had all different types of people from the different areas they conquered. They had even Romans who were slaves. You had Greek slaves, educated slaves that they used largely Greeks for their tutors and teachers for their children. And so any slave that was highly educated was largely valued because of the skills that they could provide to the home. And if you had any kind of medical training, it didn't matter. They didn't care if you were a man or a woman. That was extremely valued. And so there's lots of scenes, of birthing scenes. We have two here that highlight are shown in Roman art. In part because, again, this Roman virtue of motherhood was important. And then you also had a specific job / identity for women in being a midwife. So it was common to be seen for multiple different reasons. There were two types of ways that women often tended to give birth. Oh, actually, the most common was this one here with the birthing chair is what it was called. And they all kind of looked like this. And so it was very common for Roman women to give birth in this birthing chair, sitting up to allow kind of gravity to help assist with the birth. But there were instances of women laying down to give birth as well. Usually, if the birth was if the childbirth was extremely strenuous or long, they would switch to laying down. This one actually appears like, so the woman is attended by multiple attendants with the midwife. You have one baby that's already been delivered, and it looks like they're actually delivering another baby. So she's giving birth to twins. That would be a longer delivery process. And at some point, sitting up in the chair just might have been too exhausting. So while the birthing chair was actually preferred in the more common way that women gave birth, there were women who laid down either by choice or, again, because of the strenuous and longer if you go into delivery and it's many hours, each pregnancy varies on how long it takes to actually give birth, and it can take longer than a day. At some point you're not going to be in the chair anymore. Faster birth, the chair, but the chair tended to be preferred. Sometimes they'd lay down till right before, and then if they could move into the chair, if they were capable of doing so, they did. It just varied on that. But we get not only a look because of the art into how women gave birth in Rome, but also the role of the midwife that was seen as valuable and important enough to constantly immortalize, if you will, and portray in art, whether that was for the funerary art, which definitely if a woman was a midwife, she would want to emphasize in her funerary art, but also in other just reliefs and frescoes and paintings. It was seen not just in funerary art, but was often displayed in multiple different locations. If a woman was an independent midwife and she had like basically a business, she might have in that place where her business is, whether it's her home or a separate storefront, if you will, she would probably have various paintings or reliefs on whichever was her place of business to highlight and advertise that this was her job. So it was also a form of advertisement that could be used, along with, of course, being connected to an important virtue of women, as well as a job. And of course, did represent, not for enslaved women, but for independent midwives, a form of independence, because if they were not enslaved, they were usually very well paid and had a lot of independence and agency and freedom in the Roman world because of this profession and being aware of women's health and expertise in helping women give birth, which of course again was seen as one of their primary duties as a woman. Another job that was often shown was shopkeepers. You also had like market workers, tavern staff. These were all very common images of showing women in these positions of work. Women worked in markets as well as inns and taverns. There's many reliefs and paintings that showed women working. There were some showing women selling vegetables and poultry, actually, which is this one. So let's go to this one first. So here you have a woman who has her own stall. She's selling vegetables here. You have poultry here. And then you have, here we'll actually label them, not just put arrows to it. So you have the poultry, you have vegetables, and then you have some kind of other animal, live animal in these kind of cages. These ones are obviously dead over here. And then you have live ones. And then for whatever reason, she has some pet monkeys that are just chilling on her stand. I don't know, maybe it was an attraction. Rome always loved, the Roman Empire loved anything from any, what they considered exotic, from areas that they conquered, things brought back from Egypt, from Africa, from other campaigns and areas, anything that they could bring back and highlight. So it's not completely unusual for the Romans to try to highlight and showcase when they had unusual things, because they were always fascinated and interested by that. But it's fully a woman running and managing the market as she sells to male customers, which again, women were freely able to interact in public with men out in the open, and run their own business stalls. Again, very, very different culture and opportunities for women in Rome compared to Greece, where women would never, this would not be a scene that would be allowed in that process. You also see, if we go back to this one for a minute here, women as textile workers. Here they're being shown laundering cloth before sale, highlighting that textile work. There's also some that worked and made the cloth as well. You have, some that are dressed differently than the other two, right? This woman is more elaborately dressed than this one, potentially in the owner of the shop versus a worker. And these were often painted. Again, Romans, they loved to paint. You didn't have plain painted walls in Rome. People's homes were decorated everywhere with paintings like this, with mosaics, with frescoes, with reliefs. You almost never had a plain wall. Or just a single color. They love to paint these images and scenes in their home. So, and businesses. So a business would paint scenes from their business to highlight that. One thing that's interesting in the patrician villas, each room was, like I said, elaborately painted with all these different areas. But it was actually very common in patrician homes and of course the wealthy could afford, and business owners could afford, to paint all the rooms. This was expensive. You had to hire, unless you were an artist yourself, which some women were and painted their own rooms and stuff. But most women were hiring other artists to come in, or if there was a enslaved woman that had artistic capabilities, they would utilize her to paint their home. But you often had to commission people to come in and paint or do the mosaics or do the reliefs, depending on what you were having done. And so it was expensive. So lower class families didn't have many rooms painted. They usually still tried to have at least one wall with the scene. But there was a stark contrast in how much was painted. But in the patricians in their large villas, man, every single surface was done in artwork. The flooring were these elaborate mosaics, the walls were elaborate, everything was artwork. And what was common in some of the patrician households, in the main bedroom, they had guest bedrooms, they had other, the kids had their bedrooms, but in the main bedroom for the husband and wife, they often had erotic sex scenes painted into the room, almost as like, this is what happens in this room, or as a reminder of your marital duty, I suppose. But it was very straightforward. This room is for not just sleeping, but where we have sex. This room is where, we're going to show off where guests are going to be. So we're going to have elaborate gardens and scenes of outdoor. This room is the kitchen, so we're going to show the slaves working and baking and doing things like that. They could be very straightforward. They could do other beautiful scenes and stuff, and sometimes it was very literal. The paintings were to show what that room did, but they loved having paintings and scenes and mosaics, not just plain walls. So very colorful. I mean, you had to imagine like going into these villas, especially if any ancient city would be fun to go back in time and visit if you were embodying a wealthy individual from that society. But if you could go back in time and visit like the patrician villas in Rome, they had to have been amazing to see. You could have just spent hours just examining the artwork that was displayed and within the whole of the house. And women were almost always the ones that commissioned and directed what artwork was done within their home. While again, it still was a paterfamilias and the father was the head of the household, women were largely the ones that commissioned and had this work done in the home. So they very much played an active role in depicting what they wanted to be shown. And then we have one from a tavern or bar. And the woman is the barmaid or worker, if you will. She's holding a single glass of wine and then a larger jug of wine. Wine was the common alcoholic drink. And then as you can see, there's writing. So then there's 2 male customers that she's serving to, which again, showing women actively and engaged, involved with men in Roman society out in public in the home. There were not restrictions on this. Right, women were actively involved in being able to go out into public and engage with both men and women without restrictions, without having to have a male relative escort you around. But what it says is somewhat cheeky. This was in a bar, again, very literal, what they painted in that. And it shows a woman bringing a mug and then the large pitcher, and the writing on the fresco says, one of the males customers is saying, over here. And the other patron on the right says, so this guy here. So this guy is saying, over here. Then this guy on the right is saying, no, it's mine. And then the woman says, whoever wants it should take it. Oceanus, come here and drink. So she sounds like she's fed up with like, no, that's my drink. No, that's my drink. Bring it here. And she's like, oh my gosh, just take your stupid drinks. it definitely gives off that idea of frustration that she was experiencing. All right, next we're going to look at graffiti and women's agency in Roman society. Graffiti is super interesting. The Romans were prolific graffitiers. And they loved to graffiti. They graffitied their own houses. So not only did they have all this elaborate artwork, but then they literally would graffiti rooms in their homes. And then they would graffiti public facing walls. They would graffiti like the city walls. And there were 2 types of graffiti. You had public notices to personal inscriptions. Usually public notices, not always, were paintings, graffiti paintings, like it was used with paint. Personal graffiti tended to be like carved into the wall. Now, this was not a strict separation. It could vary, but generally speaking, public notices, and public notices could be like advertisements, political statements. If someone that was running for a local magistrator position would basically put their political ad in graffiti. Advertisements for stores and other things, sometimes poems, Greetings, gossips, that the like I said, the public notices were the paintings, the inscriptions were more the personal graffiti. And the personal graffiti could be anything. It ranged from insults to gossip about women. So in terms of what, in context of women, graffiti often insulted or gossiped about women, especially prostitutes, which certainly reflected like the view and attitude of women, and it still showed it was very much sometimes a misogynistic and patriarchal society. Scandals, they love to graffiti scandals, any scandalous news onto that. They also sometimes graffitied goddesses as well. This is the goddess Diana, or Artemis if it's Greek, and a stag. So you can see the stag here, and then this is Diana, again, same god. So the Romans took the main Olympian gods and just gave them Latin names. So Diana is Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, right? And so this graffiti here is actually of one of the goddesses. One of the graffitis in Pompeii, which again, a lot of the preservation graffiti was not super deep and definitely eroded over time, but again, because of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the graffiti on all the walls in Pompeii were pretty well preserved. And so one of the graffitis in there was on a brothel in Pompeii, on the wall outside of the brothel. And it was basically like a review, I suppose. It's not Sabrina. Sabina, you suck. You do not do it well. So insulting the prostitute, leaving a negative review in graffiti. Both men and women wrote graffiti that listed gossip about women being pregnant or cheating. There was tons of graffiti that talked about, oh, this and it would name, this woman is pregnant, or this woman was caught cheating on or being with this guy. And they like to call people out about the scandals. Women not only author graffiti about other women, but they did often make graffiti the Romans loved to put their name on things. And even in graffiti, which wasn't really seen as illegal, women would write graffiti and then put their name as the author of the graffiti. So we have a very good clue of who was putting what kind of graffiti in that. Some women, a lot of the graffiti that women wrote themselves or drew pictures of would be declaring their love or political support or support of businesses. And then also business advertisements. So women, while they could not run for office, women often use their name as a form of support, political support for their either just a male, oftentimes a male relative, husband or brother or other kin, but also sometimes women just would graffiti support for whoever politician they wanted to win with no relation whatsoever. Women weren't allowed to really speak out politically, verbally, and be actively involved in politics, but graffiti was one way that they could express their political opinion. The dinner party was actually another way that women were allowed. Like the dinner party was like its own little ecosystem that in the house, in a dinner party, women were free to speak politics and openly and aggressively speak their mind about it. But then you couldn't go out into the open city forum and shout out political speeches as a woman. So it's this kind of fine line. Likewise, you could graffiti political slogans and support for those that you wanted to support as a woman. And then if you were a well-known or wealthy woman, you would put your name specifically. You wouldn't just say, vote for this person. You would say, I, and your name, support this person. And that gave weight to the male politician based on the woman's authority. Another one, for example, one graffiti read, Methe of Atella, slave of Comenia, loves Crustus. May Venus Pompiana smile favorably on their hearts, right? She signed her name and expressed her desire publicly And she was a slave, and so she claimed her own agency even despite her lower status. It also showed that many slave women were educated and were literate. In fact, the majority of the Roman Empire were, whether they were free, patrician, plebeian, or slave, were literate. And had some level of education. Another woman wrote, "I don't want to sell my husband, not for all the gold in the world." So, love for a husband or boyfriend, but there were other times where they would call out cheating husbands. And one mother was overly nosy, and she put her name and asked her son in graffiti in their home. Maybe she was pissed. She asked her son how many women he had slept with, which is such a weird and random thing to graffiti. But I imagine it going into his like room and being like, ah, and like pissed off that he's not listening to her, and so she graffitis and asking him this question, basically like, your mother, and it was your mother, her name, wants to know how many women you have slept with. So like I said, the graffiti could be all over the place and stuff. There was also longer graffiti that were poems, and many of the longer poem graffiti was written by women. And then there was also erotic graffiti and images that usually there were not only erotic or graphic sexual like sayings, which were common, but also women, if they were portrayed in the erotic and graphic visual aspect of the graffiti, were often shown in various sexual positions. So graffiti was like this own little like artistic system that was really pretty free for anyone, no matter what class they came from, to express themselves, both in the body, in the funny, in the advertisements, in the serious, and all. Sometimes showing goddesses. You know, there was lots of graffiti about gladiators. There were lots of graffiti about women swooning over certain gladiators. So it really, kind of ran the gamut on what kind of topics that women were actively participating or being shown in this graffiti. All right, next we're going to be looking at elite women as patrons and artists and the different roles. Patrician women were very often patrons of the arts, commissioning work from artists, but there were also female artists that some that are known. There are a lot of women that were artists. We've seen other paintings showing women doing art that we don't know who they are, and there were probably plenty of women who did art within the home, but it was not a profession. But there were a few women that are mentioned in various Roman historical writings and by name as female artists, and that were clearly commissioned to do large-scale works, whether that was building projects, reliefs, sculptures, paintings. So clearly, Romans did not have an issue with hiring women artists to do these larger public arts. However, it was still a very male-dominated role. But if it wasn't within them women doing artwork themselves, what was way more common and frequent were patrician women as patrons commissioning various artwork. So the first woman that we're going to look at is Livia, the wife of Augustus. So Livia was the wife of Augustus, as I said, and she was a big patron of the arts, both how she was depicted herself and what she paid in commission for work. This one you have of the statue of Livia, right? And this is very much, both of these are idealized, right? Both her and Augustus. There's some belief that actually this is the most famous sculpture of Augustus, super idealized in like Roman virtue and value and how he looked and stuff like that, both emphasizing the Roman Senate, the military, kind of how he looked, this idea of being this noble Roman savior of the Republic and upholding Roman virtue. Here shown in this kind of praying stance, the piety was a big thing that she emphasized, pietas, and it shows her priestesses often had a veil that they wore. So to be veiled and covered like this in that praying stance, very much emphasizing her as a priestess, and piety. And there were, so like the emperor was named Pontifex Maximus, which was like head priest, and then sometimes the wives were given that title. They didn't actually necessarily practice as head priestesses, but they were given these titles of that, which is meant to emphasize, again, their piety and virtue to Rome. So that's somewhat indicating that as well. But the fact that this statue of Augustus was found in her villa that she commissioned, which is why many think that she might have had it commissioned specifically. And again, it is the most famous sculpture of Augustus that's out there. So she had not only a massive villa, but then the villa has some of the best landscape paintings that decorated her entire villa. It was by a famous painter, Studius, who was probably the most famous landscape painter at the time. And she also, her patronage activities went beyond just construction of domestic villas and environments. She commissioned a series of public buildings, like the Porticus Liviae, which was a recreational space and gardens for Roman citizens. And she also surrounded it by gardens for them to enjoy. She built the shrines of the patrician and the plebeian chastity, as well as the temple of the divine Augustus. She took her public persona and used her wealth in a public and political manner to reinforce the role of Augustus and later her son Tiberius as well. Her example was copied by other wealthy Roman women to sponsor public structures in the towns. So again, it was not just the private commissioned artwork of the private, like her villa, but she also commissioned public works. And a lot of the really, really wealthy patrician women did that. They commissioned public works that were used as somewhat, again, idealized propaganda. They always put their name on the building to make sure that everyone knew that they had paid for and commissioned this work for the citizens of Rome. And so definitely royal women, but even super wealthy women did this. Sometimes it was to gain favor. Sometimes they would use it to associate themselves with the emperor and the empress to try to gain political favor and authority. It certainly could also help make them popular with the citizens of the town if they were making useful buildings. And like, for example, the recreational space and gardens for the Roman citizens, right? That financially didn't benefit her. It was a free public place that anyone could go. But politically, it benefited her in having citizens view her in a favorable light and embodying those Roman values and virtues. Here's her villa. So besides the amazing sculptures, not just of her, but Augustus, these were the garden frescoes in her villa. It literally covered an entire room. It's in one of the museums now. But you can see all these different garden scenes that are just intricately designed. And again, this was done by Studius, he was the most famous landscape artist at the time. She probably paid a significant amount for these paintings. And you can see that it just turned this inside large room in her villa, which was probably the like entry room where visitors would first go, into this kind of like almost outside space, because it was from floor to ceiling. These gardens were the scenes were painted on. And then you have Plancia Magna, is another extremely wealthy and prominent citizen of the city of Pergae, which is now located in modern Turkey. She subsidized an elaborate monumental city gates and triumphal arch. She also initiated multiple building projects as well. And then this is a sculpture of her again. Wealthy patrician women, when they had sculptures made of them, were always shown fully clothed. Like you can see, I mean, here you have Livia fully clothed, lots of cloth all the way down to her ankles. That was meant to be shown as a woman who was of chastity, of piety, of respect, and in these idealized stances and portrayals that was meant to show them as, again, positive, strong, and certainly proud woman, but also displaying those idealized Roman virtues. So they were definitely shown in the best light in these sculptures. These weren't necessarily meant to be fully realistic. They were meant to be as flattering as possible for public consumption, essentially, because these sculptures were often in the public buildings that they commissioned, so that everyone knew who did this. Besides their name being on the building, you have a physical representation of it as well. With that, so she was a priestess, and certainly the cloak, just like Livia, was kind of shown. She had the kind of cloth in the head and the veil and the headdress of a priestess, and she was a known priestess. The crown, you can't really see, but the crown that she had actually had small busts of Roman emperors, symbolizing that she was part of the imperial cult, for the priesthood that she was part of. It also, of course, directly tied her to the emperors and the imperial religion, but she was part of that. There was specifically an imperial cult priesthood, and then she was part of that. The statue is part of this extensive complex that consisted of like a courtyard decorated with the statues of Olympian gods and the city's mythological and historical founders. Her father and brother, which were actually interestingly identified through their relationship with her, are also shown, which this is significant because usually, and that's mentioned here with this, usually women were identified through their relationship with their male relatives. So for her male relatives to be identified through their relationship to her showcases the power and wealth and just public awareness that she had. She was wealthier and more well known as a public figure than her male relatives, and usually it went the other way around, right? Livia was well known, but she was associated through Augustus, right, and Tiberius, her son. But in this case, it was the reverse of this. So it just showcases how prominent and how wealthy she actually was. The arch was super prominent. It had an inscription which it showed her that named her and said that she was dedicating the arch to the city. It was decorated with statues of members of the imperial family, including many female members. And this is most, again, likely this propaganda in wanting to associate herself with the female members of the imperial family to give her status and recognition in Rome. And it just, again, highlights the power and wealth that she had. And she utilized that through, in many ways, architecture, artwork, to highlight that. These are the remains of the archway and then the surrounding area. So all of these, you can see them here too, but all of these little niches and stuff, and you can kind of see the pedestals that remain. There would have been sculptures here. So this is where the gods and goddesses, the mythological and historical founders, the imperial family, and both men and women, there would have been individual statues in each one of these alcoves, if you will, right? So when this was actually, complete and not just ruins and stuff, this isn't the only building. This is just one of the ruins and stuff. This would have been super impressive because not only did you have this elaborate entryway and building, but then to have so many sculptures on either side, and you can see they're on both sides of the building, right? That it just would have been an extremely impressive thing, and that's part of that propaganda, though, right? The idea of just how impressive and kind of awe-inspiring this was. All right, now we're gonna look at female artists. I have of Cicerus, Aristarete, and Timorete, and Irene. Aya is also sometimes Lala or Leia, or I think Marina. She had lots of different names and stuff. So one of the things is, as you'll notice, this this painting does not seem like the others. That's because this was not a Roman painting. None of these women artists were named by Pliny the Elder in his writings, and it is significant that they were artists themselves and were named, and as well as their works. At least one of their works public works that they were commissioned to do. So it's significant in that sense that they were women were specifically named as female artists, but none of their paintings or works have survived. So we don't have any examples of what their artwork looked like. We don't have any sculptures of them or paintings of them. This was actually a French painting. I think the 1400s is when this one was done, of her. So again, we don't have any actually contemporary artwork of her or from her or any of the other women that we're going to be looking at here, but they were all mentioned again by Pliny the Elder, and not much. These are very short mentions. He mentioned that she was never married. She painted pictures with a brush in Rome, and also was a graver on ivory. Her main thing was actually portraits of women and of herself. And he specifically mentions that she looked in a looking glass or mirror to do her self-portraits, which is what's portrayed here, but that she was a well-known portrait artist of women, as well as a large picture on wood of an old woman at Neapolis, also a portrait of herself done with a looking glass. This is the quote from him: "No one else has a quicker hand in painting. While her artistic skill was such that in prices she obtained, she far outdid the most celebrated portrait painters of the same period." So she actually had the longest mention by Pliny the Elder. There was Pliny the Younger too, his son. And so that was a quote from him, right? Never married, painted pictures with the brushes in Rome. But the fact that he says not only was she quicker, no one was quicker than hand in painting, but that she could charge, this says specifically, while her artistic skill was such that in prices she obtained, she far outdid the most celebrated portrait painters of the same period, which suggests that she was so well known that she could charge more than all of the male portrait painters. She largely painted women's portraits, as well as she was known for doing self-portraits. But he also lists these other things that she did: carving ivory, a specific picture on wood of an old woman. But she was most well known for, and what she obviously was paid very, very well for, was her portraits. These were probably all done largely by commissioned by wealthy women that were displayed in their home, which is why they aren't things that have survived. They weren't the large, massive public stone sculptures that were able to survive the ravages of time. Right, they were largely in homes that ended up eventually getting torn down, or the paintings faded over time and stuff like that. But it's significant that he's specifically mentioning in there that she by far outdid anyone in what she could get paid. Even the most famous portrait painters could not match her popularity. Right, so clearly there were celebrated and respected women artists that many people wanted to get paintings from, or carvings, and mostly her portraits, it sounds like, and she dabbled in a few other things. Pliny also mentions Aristarete, the daughter of Nearchus, who painted Asclepius. That's all that's mentioned of her, right? That she was a daughter of a painter, and that what she painted, right? So It was essentially, why did the arrow start showing with this? The name, her daughter of painter, and the artwork. And that's it. So super, again, Aya had the most description and information. She probably was the most well known, but it does suggest, and this is common for women in art throughout any time period, that if you had male relatives who were artists, they had a better chance of becoming professional artists, right? These were professional artists. There were plenty of women who were artists that weren't professional artists that just did so in their home. But these were professional artists that were able to sell and were paid and commissioned to do artwork. And since women were not largely encouraged into the professional art world, when women were able to break into it was largely because they had fathers who were artists that they were trained under and had some connections to the art world to then start being seen as a professional artist themselves. Then he mentions Timarete was named as the daughter of Maicon, and then he lists what Maicon painted, which was, he says, this is the quote from this: Maicon painted a very archaic panel portrait of Diana at Ephesus. He then mentions that Maicon was a painter, and that's about it from Timarete. And then Irene was also mentioned, again, learning painting from her father. This is the quote from her: she learned from her father as well and painted a maiden at Eleusis. That's it, right? So the women were unique for being the professional artists at the time, but we don't know. That's all we know about them. That's it. And even Pliny, well, obviously they were well known enough to be named. He didn't put a lot of time or effort into giving more details about them. And even clearly a woman who could charge more money than the most famous portrait painters of the time had still only a small paragraph written about her. But clearly what it does indicate is that there were professional women artists in Rome that were respected enough to be commissioned to do work, public works, to get paid for their artwork, and at least were known enough that Pliny knew their names to write them down, which is significant, even if it seems very minor in the amount of detail that we know about it. All right. I want to look at women in Pompeii specifically because we get a lot of information from Pompeii. Also, Pompeii seems to have been more open for women in many ways than, as much as there were opportunities for women in Rome and art, and we see that in the artwork of how women were portrayed. Pompeii seems to be almost at this other level in that process as well. Pompeii, of course, was famous for its destruction with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and it provides insights in daily life into women's roles because when it erupted, it left a whole city preserved that day. Some people were able to flee, but there were also plenty of people who did not and were killed and covered in molten hot ash and perished immediately, and then were kind of mummified and preserved. Well, actually, I guess they're kind of, there was, what was left was a hole of their body, and then they actually filled it with plaster. We have the plaster images of these people where they died and how they died, because the ash hardened around their bodies, the bodies decomposed, but the hardened ash left a mold that then the plaster can be put into. But because people either died where they were or fled quickly, it left behind household items. Obviously all the artwork and graffiti was preserved, even food. We have like a loaf of bread from Pompeii that was preserved, and actually we know the recipe because it was listed on the vendor's stall. But like the loaf itself was this perfectly preserved loaf of bread, well, by hardened ash and stuff. And so it gives this perfect view into the city of Rome, a specific city in Rome on that day, that you don't get anywhere else because of the evolution, because of time changing and all of that. What's interesting is the patron deity for Pompeii was Venus, and this is one of the portrayals of her, Venus, and which is Aphrodite, and she was portrayed. She both symbolized fertility and motherhood. Right, she was fertility and sex, but also a symbol of the mater familia, the mother family, or the great mother. Sometimes she was shown as unclothed as here. Other times she was heavily robed. Right, so there was this dichotomy of this, of both being respectable and then somewhat seen as the more sexual fertility, goddess of love and lust aspect as well. But also, again, seen as this kind of great mother. The Greeks kind of focused mostly just on the sexual side of Aphrodite, whereas in Pompeii, at least, they tended to show her in a more dichotomy between these two kind of methods. A temple was built for her there and made up of around 300 columns, which was super impressive for its size and design at the time. And certainly this dual nature of Venus, of Pompeii, provides some indication that some of the attitudes of women in the city, especially when there's evidence where they're actively involved outside of the home in civic, religious, and economic life, had perhaps a little more freedom and power than women in other areas. And that's not necessarily unheard of. Each city had its own kind of cultural aspect of Rome to it. And especially if your patron deity is Venus, it makes sense why that might direct towards a larger emphasis of women. There was lots of documentation of inscriptions, paintings in homes, tombs, all these things that highlighted women's roles in daily activities. Several of the inscriptions and artwork mentioned public priestesses. Mamia was one who was given a burial plot on land donated by the Council of Pompeii, right? And so the fact that she didn't pay for her burial plot and the funerary stuff, but that the Council of Pompeii donated that land for her suggests that she was important. And Eumachia was also probably the most well-known priestess. She was the priestess of the Roman agricultural deity. This cult, so that's her, the agricultural deity. This cult was exclusively female leaders, and she was both involved in religious leadership and her family business, which produced pottery. And she actually took over the family business when her father died. So she was actively involved in making pottery, or at least managing the making of pottery with the family business. She was extremely wealthy. She donated a building in her and her son's name and dedicated the building to the Concordia Augustus and Pietas, which again is the personification of Livia. And the piety again, right? Those ideal values of Rome. I skipped over this artwork. I was like, why is this one here before that? So when we're talking about the different views of women and the dichotomy, right? It was common in Pompeii to show women this is the woman with the stylus. This is a wax tablet, which was a common tablet to write in, and then you could smooth it over when you were done. You could also press it with ink, and if you wanted to preserve it with paper. And then she's holding the stylus, like in this up to her lips, almost like she's pensive and thinking. The fact that they showed there were multiple paintings of women holding a stylus and either a scroll or a wax tablet suggests women as scribes, as educated. Right, so that there was specific art that highlighted women as educated in Pompeii and were central figures of that as significant. Here's another one showing women and the family, the husband, and then the family lounging. So, right, again, that was just with the introduction of Pompeii and the art that I was talking about. Here is Humahia from Pompeii. So this is her again, very similar with the veil and the clothing. It looks very similar to Livia, and others. That this is part of the what is left of the building that she donated. Right. And then she had again, she had also a statue that she had made of Concordia, that had like a cornucopia, and some say that like the face was meant to look like Livia, and potentially to make that connection. There were also statues of Aeneas, Romulus, Julius Caesar, and Augustus, all people who were seen central to the founding and authority of Rome, both past and present. Right, all of these things. And then her statue here was located in the building, in one of the main buildings, in a centralized location as well, right? And the idealized Roman style that was meant to highlight, again, womanly virtue and piety. So that tended to be like the most, like, I think, beneficial idealization of wealthy Roman women. Another woman that was well known was Julia Felix in Pompeii, and she actually had her house became the House of Julia Felix. And she was an entrepreneurial woman who expanded her housing to have baths, gardens, shops. I believe that she actually was initially lower class, and then utilized some benefits to become extremely wealthy. This is one of the paintings in her homes where she had dining rooms both for like the lower classes and the wealthy. She had like multiple different types of baths, and rental homes and things like that. So her home became the largest baths in Pompeii after a large earthquake destroyed the public baths. And she realized, being close to the amphitheater, that she could actually make money and end up preserving her home and expanding it if she opened up her baths to the populace. And so she started with the baths as essentially becoming a public bathhouse in her home, and then expanded from there to create a massive income and be super, super well known. Her house was had the different types of baths. She had a dry sweating room filled with hot air, a bath of unheated water, a warm bath, one that contained hot water, a swimming pool. The house had an area for food and wine bars. The eating house would serve food and drink and lodging to lower class visitors. A dining room that was super large, meant for wealthier patrons. There was also a massive garden that people could walk and sit and enjoy. These are some of the rooms, and a canal. So this was the gardens and canal. And she had all of this created. She wrote about how she started, when she first started, she's the one that wrote the graffiti that advertised in painting that her house was available. And then she commissioned the expansion of her house with the baths and the dining and the shops, and each room, and how it was painted and displayed. This is the map of what it became. So it was quite large. But she was actively involved in every aspect of this. So besides patronage in buildings and sculptures, women were portrayed in several paintings and art in Pompeii as businesswomen, as social participants. This one is a dinner party. And you get a look at, which specifically what's significant about this dinner party is it's all women. Usually dinner parties in Rome were both men and women. So it is unique that this was an all-female dinner party. You have a musician here playing a musical instrument. You have female slaves peeking out over the curtain, observing the party going on. You can certainly see by the clothing that these were wealthier women having this party. But it certainly highlights their role, a prominent role in Pompeii. and I think some of the power, social and economic power that they had. You had other ones that showed women selling bread and other produce, um, and then others with the scribes, as I showed earlier, and the idea that women were educated, and that was emphasized in the artwork is significant as well. So certainly the art seems to indicate, along with what we know of women that were patrons in Pompeii and the Julia Felix house, that women had a level of kind of economic freedom and social political freedom in Pompeii that might have been a little more freer than other cities in the Roman Empire. Or we may just be getting a better snapshot because everything was preserved, and so it highlighted it. But the fact that they did have their patron deity be Venus and how she is portrayed does seem to suggest that they probably were a little more emphasized than other cities, which again is completely common. Each city had its own kind of identity to it in the Roman world. All right. Now we're moving on to Roman women and art in early Christianity. And so I do apologize. This one's a little bit longer, but there's lots to talk about. We're only looking at the early period of Christianity here, so it's not going to go into too much detail with that. All right. So early Christianity developed in the Roman world, and yet was extremely misunderstood and was actually seen for a while as just another Jewish sect. Most were actually unaware of its existence until Nero. And that's when most Romans became aware of Christianity. The earliest depiction of the Romans depicting Christianity was in graffiti. This says Alexamenos worships his god, and it shows a man's body with the head of a donkey, and it shows the Alexamenos here worshiping. And it was meant to be an insult. You can see his butt. He doesn't look like he's wearing pants. And the fact that he had a head of a donkey. There were so many misconceptions and rumors that Romans wrote about what Christians did. They said they were cannibals. They killed babies. They were they skulked around and had things to hide, without, of course, acknowledging that they kind of were hiding because they were sometimes persecuted. But it's interesting to see the misconceptions the Romans had. But part of the reason that they had those misconceptions were because of how they became aware of them. So the city of Rome, many of the districts in the actual central city of Rome burned to the ground when Nero was emperor. And he ended up being blamed for it because he had bragged publicly that he could tear down Rome and rebuild it, and it would be much better. He wasn't around when it happened, but he got blamed. Soon there were rumors that he was on the hill with the lyre playing as Rome burned. He didn't want to be blamed for that, so he was looking for a scapegoat. One of his slaves suggested that he blame the Christians because no one liked them anyway, and he ended up doing that. He claimed Christians were responsible for the fire in Rome. Tacitus, a Roman historian, wrote that everyone knew that the Christians were just a scapegoat, that Nero made them a scapegoat, but they deserved it because they were antisocial and no one liked them. There's like Pliny the Younger wrote, like, basically the Christians deserved to be tortured and executed because they were ridiculously stubborn and superstitious. So mostly it was that they didn't conform to Roman values, specifically sacrifice. So one of the things was that Romans saw the act of sacrifice, wine and animals and stuff, that you would give sacrifices to the emperor of Rome and to the gods. But more importantly, it was a public display of essentially your loyalty to Rome. In fact, many well-known Romans said they didn't believe in the gods, and they didn't care. They didn't care if you actually believed in any of the actual religion. the act of sacrifice and the connection of religion got intermingled with the emperor and the politics. And so sacrifice became a public display of loyalty to Rome, where they didn't actually care if you believed or not. It was there to show that your duty to Rome. Just like going to the gladiator games. Even one Roman senator said he despised the brutality of the gladiator games, but he went because it was a public display of his duty to Rome. Right, so you publicly, you did your duty, whether you liked it or not, or you believed it or not. It didn't matter. They didn't care. So they didn't understand why Christians refused to sacrifice, because the Christians, the idea was Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice, so they no longer had to sacrifice, and that to sacrifice was seen as somewhat rejecting God. So they absolutely refused sacrifice. Now, many Christians eventually were Roman citizens, and they tried to say, like, look, we're Romans. We like Rome. We love Rome. We're proud Roman citizens. We pray for the Roman emperor to be successful and for Rome to be, glorious, but we won't sacrifice because that's against our religion. But to the Romans, they're like, but we don't care if you believe it or not. Just do this. So their stubborn refusal to sacrifice was seen as something that was, they called them stupid and stuff like that as well. And it was seen as stupid, essentially. Like you're being stupid for not just sacrificing. We don't care if you actually believe it. It's just your public display of loyalty to the Roman Empire. And they didn't understand, the Christians, that it was almost like betraying God and the promise of Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice for their sins. And so that's why they wouldn't do it. And so that miscommunication led to the Romans really not liking the Christians. And of course, Nero blaming them for the fires didn't help, in that basically the Christian name became a negative connotation. So the first real entry into the Roman world where Romans became aware of the Christians was with the name Christian having a negative connotation attached to the fires of Rome. And again, most eventually knew they were scapegoats, but that negative connotation stuck. Eventually, Nero had to stop, and the persecution only was centrally in the city of Rome itself. If you were a Christian outside of the city of Rome, you weren't affected by this first persecution. But eventually Nero had to stop, because even though they were willing to say, whatever, we don't care initially, he got so depraved and brutal in the torture and public executions of Christians that eventually people were like, oh my God, he's crazy. And eventually he realized like that his scapegoats were, he was going to lose any, I don't know, not favor, but certainly reprieve he had from being blamed for the fires if he kept going. So he finally declared that all of the Christians that had been participants of the fire were rooted out. But what it did is there wasn't an official like persecution, empire-wide persecution again until Diocletian, which is much, much later. Instead, it was left to the magistrates of each local region to like determine how to deal with Christians if there were issues. Some magistrates did nothing. They didn't think the Christians were doing anything illegal. They didn't prosecute them or torture them or kill them. Others, they would deal with Christians if they were brought before them. Like Pliny the Younger wrote to the Emperor Trajan and said, okay, these people were brought to me as Christians. Here's what I did, which was basically interrogate them, i.e. torture, and then ask them to sacrifice to the emperor. And if they didn't, then he said I would torture them and say, are you sure you want to say you're a Christian? And then they would say yes. He's like, but I'm going to keep interrogating you. Are you sure you want to say you're Christian? And they would say yes. And he's like, they were like ridiculously, stupidly stubborn, because I'm telling them I'm going to torture them, and I'm telling them I'm giving them a way out. Just say you're not Christian. But again, not understanding that to deny that was seen as denying God. And then he said, and then I give him another out, which would be like, just sacrifice to the emperor and then you can go your way. And when they refused to do that, then he executed them and stuff. And he asked Pliny if this was the way to do it. And Pliny said, yes, but don't search him out. People shouldn't be making anonymous accusations. Don't go hunting Christians. So again, but the problem was that this meant that Christianity kind of wasn't out in the open. They didn't have their own public churches because Romans saw them as again, superstitious, a negative connotation. They saw them as forming illegal associations. Because they would gather together without approval from Rome, and potentially subversive, which is why they were executed officially, because they refused to sacrifice for the glory of Rome. Essentially, if you're refusing to sacrifice to Rome, you must be against Rome. So they were therefore subversive. So early Christianity took place in people's homes. And they would just meet in groups and homes and eat together and do worship and prayer. But they didn't want to advertise that these homes were for all Romans to know that they were Christian homes, because there was always the risk, even if you were in a friendly magistrate area, that you might get hauled in depending on the situation. So early Christian art actually were kind of these secret symbols that were largely known just to the Christians initially. Eventually Romans caught on to some of them. But a lot of the early Christian art were symbols that were used to highlight and show for other Christians to know that this home was a Christian home where they could meet to worship. Largely, these were probably done by women, because women, as head of the household, or not head of the household, the men were, but responsible for the home. We know women in the early churches and the home churches were active participants in these gatherings. And so probably many of these, and there are probably some done by men too, but women probably had a role in these. There were various symbols. This one was the spoke or wheel of Christ, which was based on Greek letters that could be formed in the wheel. Here are some of the other symbols. So fish were common, with, of course, Jesus being like fisherman, a fisherman of men. Doves were common symbols, right? Here's another one with fish. And then this is the Chi Rho, which is the X and the P. So the X and the P put together to create the Chi Rho. And what that was essentially, it would combine the first two Greek letters of Christos, X and P, and they combined them together. So the cross was not actually an early symbol of Christianity. That came later. All of these images and artwork that were almost like graffiti, but not exactly graffiti, but had a very similar characteristic to it. These were put again on tombstones and homes of Christians, both men and women, to signify that they're Christians without it being a neon flashing light to the rest of the Romans in the area that they were Christians. And so then other Christians would know, if they saw some of these symbols, that they could go to this home and worship. And they were vague enough, the Chi Rho less so once it got to be known, but the wheel and the other, they were vague enough that like you could kind of be like, oh, we are fishermen in this home, or we liked the dove, right? It wasn't clear whether they were connected to Christianity or not. But again, women probably had a role in these very, very early symbols, because they were attached to homes, which they were active participants in bringing together and managing the early worship within the home. Now, some of the earliest Christian art was catacomb art. In these early catacombs that were for various tombs for Christians. And what you see within the catacomb art is the Roman style and influence, right? The women and how they were portrayed, and the men, and even the painting style was very Romanesque in its nature. So here we have a woman being healed by Jesus. Also, it's like Jesus is shown as young. He's younger, short hair, and beardless. And then, of course, their clothing is very Roman in nature. Right. This Romanesque period is very much, I mean, they were many of the Christians were Roman citizens. The Christianity developed in Rome. It's not surprising that their early art was Roman style of art. And so we see early Christian women were portrayed as very much looking like Roman women, probably because many times they were. But even when they were showing like biblical scenes, like this one is Jesus healing, Jesus was during that period. When they showed, there's some artwork of like Old Testament artwork. All of the Old Testament artwork was also shown in the Roman style. So this is like a contemporary scene with, like, again, Jesus being portrayed in Roman dress and style, because he grew up in a Roman province and stuff like that. But like I said, the Older Testament biblical scenes were also shown in that Roman style. This one is Mary, and my pen just stopped working. Hang on. All right, so this one here is Mary praying. Again, the praying stance that you see. And one of the things that becomes clear in this early period of art is that women are shown to have an active and very involved role in early Christianity, and often we're seen in these roles of teachers and leadership. We know women were called deaconesses. In part, again, they had this central role within the home, within the church. The women's role, as it become Constantine, a later Roman emperor, much later, is going to eventually convert to Christianity and then make it legal and then start supporting it. And when Christianity becomes fully legal and state supported, what we end up seeing is women slowly get pushed out of any kind of position of leadership and authority in the church. But in the early period, when it was still somewhat clandestine and illegal in many cases, we see the artwork seems to indicate that women had a much more central role within Christianity, and were seen as respected leaders in that. With that, so we have here is the Brescia casket, which was an ivory box that had carved reliefs over the entire surface of it. And the reliefs appeared in these kind of Hellenistic style of that Roman relief style of that, in clothing and facial features and general style and whatnot. And it had a variety of scenes from biblical stories, from Jesus to Old Testament stories as well. And so the full box you can see here, right? And then this front side, you have, again, this is the scene of Jesus healing the woman with the bleeding condition, which was the same as this painting. So this is the same woman in the same scene, just in a relief versus a painting. And then we have on the right and back side, you have the Trial of Susanna. So the Trial of Susanna was, and then you have also this woman here praying. I think actually that's Susanna as well. But one of the things that Susanna was falsely accused of having an affair because she refused two elders' sexual advances, but was saved by Daniel. And then you have Jacob and Rebecca at the well, which is portraying her here. So again, this is the example of Old Testament stories that were obviously actually the Mesopotamia region, but are shown in this Romanesque style. They didn't change it because of that. So and then this is Susanna praying by the trees and whatnot. So the casket, the catacombs all showed women in multiple stories, and obviously seen as important, and usually showing them as faithful and honest in their beliefs. And then we see a lot of Christian sarcophagi, where women are shown as educated, pious, wealthy, influential within Christianity, right? It depicts them as leaders and active participants in church life before it was marginalized by Constantine. This was the most common pose in showing women. So one was that it was just women praying. The Orant is the name that was given for this praying woman or pose. They actually showed men sometimes in this pose, but it was largely women that were shown this way. But what is interesting is that while this was a common thing that suggests, of course, that they were pious and faithful, it also the fact that this artwork showed more women in this pose than anywhere else tends to highlight that women seem to be the more pious and faithful religious figures over men, right? And certainly highlights their importance of their faith. But we see it goes further than this, where it showcases actually women as central in these reliefs for the sarcophagi, where they are the center of, not only the center of attention, we're surrounded by men, but in scenes that seem to indicate that they were teachers and leaders and preachers, right? Here the woman is holding a scroll. Here she's holding another kind of text. And in this one, she's praying while the men look on. Here again, surrounded by men and potentially Jesus. But that she's kind of the central figure that they're listening to. Right. And in any of these cases, the fact that she's a central figure with a scroll, with other religious texts, seems to indicate some aspect of teaching or preaching, or certainly that they were respected and important enough that all these men would be listening to what they had to say. And then you have the orant figures of the praying pose with the hands up that suggest, again, that women were highlighted in early Christian art as an ideal in piety and faith. And both regular women and women of the biblical stories, right? This eventually is going to decline. Women are going to kind of get pushed out of any kind of role within the Christian church, and artwork and how women are depicted is going to change over time because of that, which we'll look at into the Byzantine period, which develops after Constantine. It still is connected to the Roman world, but becomes its own separate Christian empire because of the transformation after Constantine. And so Byzantine art takes on a more Greek-ish style, even though they technically are connected to the Romans. It's interesting in that transformation because of that. All right, so that's where we'll end today. I apologize that this was a much longer lecture, but there was just quite so much I didn't want to cut certain things, and so it kind of ended up longer than planned, but all stuff that I thought was important to highlight and showcase, as women were very active participants, clearly both as artists and in the art, and highlighted in these two different areas. All right, like I said, next week we will look at Byzantine art.